Before we get into actually creating this parameter and applying it to all these various nodes, I want to create a couple of standalone functions that I can reuse, because what we're going to be doing is going into these levels nodes and adjusting certain parameters, and there's going to be a lot of repetition of the same formula over and over again, and the only thing we're going to be doing is changing the actual numbers that get plugged into it. So in situations like this, it's actually a lot easier if we create a couple of standalone functions. And we're going to do two of them. The first function we're going to create is going to invert whatever the polish level input is, because in some of the situations we're going to want that number to move up when the slider is actually moving down. I'm in my function. I've double-clicked on my function graph, and just like with the regular graph, at the bottom here I have input parameters, and I'm going to put in a couple of input parameters here. The first one is going to be my polish input, and this is going to accept whatever the polish information is from the main graph. The second input I'm going to make here is what I'm going to call a polish multiplier, and this is going to be a number that I can apply against this polish that can make it smaller or bigger, because in some cases we're going to want to have those increments smaller as we move the slider up and down, and I believe in one case we're going to want it bigger. And by putting this multiplier in here, it lets us use the same formula for all of the various things that we're going to be using with it. Since our slider is only going to be going between 0 and 1, in order to invert whatever this is, all I have to do is subtract the polish input from 1, and it'll give me the inverse. So if this is 1, 1 minus 1 is 0, that's the inverse, and it'll work up and down the line. Then I want to take this result and I want to multiply it by my polish multiplier. And this will allow this input to vary according to whatever the need is whenever this function is used. And then I just set this as the output node. The other function I want to make is what I'm calling a bracket, because let's look at this levels node, for example. I'm going to want, in certain situations, we're going to want to set a floor and a ceiling for where we want to go as far as this input goes. Here in the roughness, for example, we may not want this slider to go above this number here. And by creating this little bracket function, it's going to limit, we can set limits for each one of these as to how far we want any of these sliders to go. So again, we should call this, give this a name. I'm going to rename it, and we're going to call it polish inverse. And let's make another one, and this one we'll call polish brackets. Again, I'm going to create my polish input parameter, and then I'm going to create two more inputs, one for my low end and one for my high end. So we have our polish input, low end, and high end. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to set up a comparison. We want a greater than or equal, and we also want a lower than or equal. and a couple of control nodes. So if our polish input is less than our low end number, then I want to see my low end number because I don't want to go any lower than this. Otherwise, I want to see my polish input. If the result of whatever this is greater than my high end number, then I don't want it to go any higher than that. Use the high end number. Otherwise, use what this is. And then we set this as our output node. So before we actually start doing this, we have to do one more thing, and that is to create our polish input parameter. And this is going to be a float 1. And we're going to leave it at the defaults with the polish on full as our starting point. Okay, so let's just go down the line and start to apply some numbers to this. Now we've got our two sort of basic building blocks here, and I'm going to just go by my notes. My test material actually already looks pretty different from this, but we'll start with that, and if it doesn't work out, we'll adjust it from there, but it gives us some place to start. So with the ambient occlusion, we're going to adjust the height depth because as things get chunkier, we want that depth to go up. So I'm going to create an empty function. I'm going to get in there. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that polish variable we just made. And then in here, I'm going to get my polish inverter because as our polish goes down, this number needs to go up. And we're also going to get a multiplier. And in this case, we're really we're dealing between 0.01, which is where we had it set when we were kind of just eyeballing it. And this, I believe, is 0.1, so this is already super deep. And that means I really want to scale down the way this slider is working in this particular case. So I'm going to use a 0.01 as the multiplier for polish in my polish invert. I'm going to get an addition node, and since this is my floor, when this is 0, I don't want this to be nothing at all. So I'm just going to add that number on the end of it. And now we'll get our bracket, and we'll set our overall low and high numbers. So my polish information is there. So I've set the scale at which it's moving and its inversion here. My low end is going to be this 0.01. And then from my notes, I had 0.3 set in here. And we set that as the output node. So far, so good. That looks okay. The color, we actually want to do one more thing to this color before we add functionality to it, and that is another Hue Saturation Node. Because this is where I'm going to be, I don't want to do, you could, I suppose, if you really want to complicate your life, start doing it individually here. But what we're doing in these areas is actually sort of setting the overall wood quality and the color and all of that. All I'm doing here is weathering it. So whatever colors I've set in here, I just want one global tweak here. And we go into the saturation, empty function. Now, again, with the saturation, I don't want it to start saturating straight away. I want it to wait sort of till the end or till the bottom half before it does anything like that. And since I'm not inverting it, I'm kind of going to do the same thing that we did in this function. I'm just going to do it out here. And I'm going to put in 0.5 here. And this is going to just have the distance this slider is moving. And again, we're going to get an addition node, so we're not going to let it go below a certain number when this is 0. And that number is 0.4. because I really don't want I don't want the color changing that much. So, we're only really dealing with a small increment, which is enough because you still want it to look like the wood. You just want it to look like it's weathered. And we'll bring that bracket in here. That's our polish information. Our high number is going to be this, and our low number is going to be that. And we'll set it as our output node. And what this is going to do then is it's not going to actually kick in until we get between 0.5 and 0.4. Now the normals, we're actually going to set each one of these separately. So let's start with this guy. So we're going to get our polish variable. We're going to get our inverse and our multiplier. This time we're going to use 1.286 because I actually want this. I want the highest results, when it's at its deepest, to be more than 1. And then we're kind of repeating ourselves over and over again here by adding whatever this low end number is, so it doesn't actually go down to 0. And our high end number we're going to set here as 1, so we know that at its very highest it's going to be 1.286 because that's going to be the multiplier of the polish. And then finally we get our brackets and we plug in this information all over again. So we have our low number and we have our high number and we set the output node. Still looking okay. The next one we're going to deal with is the finer grain. And here it's just the normal intensity. So we're making an empty function. And basically repeating ourselves over and over and over again, which is why we made these two functions to begin with, because it saves an awful lot of time. And we'll set this as the output node. And finally we have this one, and again we're going to be changing the intensity. And this number is higher because I do want at any given point my rings to be rougher than the smoother bits. And that's the normals done. Let's do the roughness next. Now here we're going to deal with each one of these guys separately. Because it's not, they don't necessarily go up and down exactly the same way together as you're roughing up the wood. I tried it and it actually works. It actually makes a big difference if you take care of them separately. It looks nicer. So let's start with the smoother one. Now here we're going to be dealing with the level out high. And if we want to actually put a function on that, we have to go into the values. And here I can create an empty function. Yeah, that's nice. That looks actually very similar to what I had before. So fingers crossed it's gonna accept the same inputs as I had with my test. And this one again, we're dealing with the level out high. So we're dealing with this slider here. You know what? I'm tired of doing this. I'm going to come in here. I'm just going to copy it. And we're just going to change the numbers. Actually, they're exactly the same. I just looked at my notes. That's convenient. Yep, that looks good. I'm happy. And next is our specular level. And we're going to do the same thing here, where we're just going to treat each one differently. And we're dealing with the level out highs again. But this time, we're not going to invert it because we actually want it to go in the direction the slider is going. So it's a little bit different, but it's the same idea. And because we're not inverting it, we're going to do that multiplier out here. And that's my polish information. And now I'm just going to stick in a high and a low in here. So with this, I'm telling it to move at a certain speed. And this is not mathematically correct. I just suck at math, and I just want to sort of kind of make it move quicker because it's not moving that far of a distance. And it's good enough for government work. And we'll set this as our output node. And finally, we will do this one. Actually, we still have our height to do. And we're going to, again, we're going to do the level out high. And it, you know, I'm going to copy it's different numbers, but I'm going to copy the setup. It's the same. So I still want it to move at the same increment, but these numbers I'm going to change. And we'll set this as the output node. And that makes these guys just slightly less specular than the smoother bits. And finally, we are going to deal with our height. Now here I'm going to add another levels node, and we're going to take care of the height globally from here, and we're going to have to readjust these, and we'll do the differential between the two different kinds of wood in these two. But let's set this up first. And again, we're going to be dealing with the level out high. So this slider right here. So the multiplier we're going to leave as 1. And this will be our low number. And this will be our high number. And we'll plug everything into our bracket. But what we did here earlier, we set this up for our shiniest, and we actually have it as our shiniest right now. So what I want to do, this is a little too flat now. So I'm going to come back into here, and I'm going to readjust these. So that's probably better for now. We may end up having to readjust them again. But that looks pretty good right now. Let's see what happens when we move our slider. Yeah. So that part anyway is working. It's like really bleached and faded here. And then once it passes through the halfway mark, the color doesn't really change. It's just the glossiness. So far so good. The one thing it's not really doing yet though is when it's getting rough, it's not changing this mask. And that's what this blend node is for. So here, what we're going to do is we're not going to do it in the levels. We're going to do it with opacity. Because as that opacity comes down, this gets rougher and rougher because we're seeing more of the underneath and less of the top one. So I'm going to create an empty function here, and we'll get in there. So this one is actually going to move right along with the variable. And we could, if we wanted to, just go ahead and set this as the output node and have it move 1 to 1, and that would be fine. But the thing is that I don't really want it to start roughing up until it's a bit further down the slider. I'm going to create a comparison that's not going to let it move until it gets below 0.75. And this way, as our polish goes down, all the other stuff starts to happen, but it's not until we get below 0.75 that we're starting to see it rough up. But then we're letting it go all the way down to 0. So that is pretty much done. And we're ready to send it out and see what it looks like in Unreal. So I'm going to publish it to my Unreal workspace. We're going to call Basic Wood, and I'll see you in the engine. So here we are in Unreal, and this is actually the test material I had made. And let's go ahead and import our Basic Wood. And we'll let it create a material for us. And here it is. Now, before we do anything to before we actually hook up the material, I want to go into the instance, and I'm going to check my spec level, and I'm going to check my height. And what that's done is it's actually added these two outputs to what's available to use in the material, and we're going to save that. And then we double click on our material, and we can actually start to edit this. It's hooked up the default outputs already for us, and we're going to be adding two more. We're going to add height and spec level. So I'm going to right click, and we'll get a texture sample parameter 2D, and I'll just copy that, and this one we'll call spec level. And then all we have to do is assign the appropriate output. And the specular level we can just go ahead and plug in here. And we didn't make a metallic. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug a constant 0 in there because that's all it really needs. Now the height, we have no place to put the height at the moment, and that's because we need to set up the tessellation in the material itself. By default, it's not on, and we come down here and we will set our tessellation to the tessellation of our choice. I like to have crack-free displacement, and I'm going to set that to 1. And we'll hook that into our world displacement. The other thing we want to set up is our Tessellation Multiplier, and I'm going to get another constant for this one. And this number determines the density of our tessellation. So in other words, the higher this number, the more little extra verts it adds. So you get more detail in your height map. But remember, you know, the displacement's only going to really render out according to what your actual vertices are. So you don't want it to go too much over. I mean, this is wood, so it, you know, it's pretty shallow anyway. But you know, you fool around with these numbers until you get something that kind of hits a sweet spot as far as your tessellation versus weirdnesses with the way your material renders out. And actually, we didn't have it out. So we're going to save our material. And then we can just go ahead and apply it to our cube here. And here we go. We have this wood, which, you know, honestly, I think looks pretty good. And if we pull out our instance again, we can adjust the roughness and the polish with our exposed parameter here. And I'm pretty happy with this. I think the way, you know, this is like the highest polish. I'm getting a nice specularity in there. I'm going to go ahead and call this done. So in the next series, what I want to do is I want to take this wood texture we just made, and I want to go ahead and turn it into a wood floor, which we'll do the next time around.